So I just want to say a few things. When we got the idea for this event, we knew that we really wanted something that was going to feel like community. That was going to feel like coming together and having conversations. Because, of course, the climate crisis is a situation that we are all in together and that we are only getting through if we do it together. And so, you know, this event is a bit of a mashup in form. We're bringing together the sort of panel conversation structure with a workshop. So we're going to sort of bounce between talking to one another, and then the four of us are going to have a conversation, and we're going to sort of switch back and forth. And you know, we've all been trained through our lovely education system to like sit back and be in this very didactic dynamic with the people who are in the front of the room, the experts who have all the answers. And I want to invite you as we start our journey tonight to like take that training and just like toss it out the door. Everybody here has wisdom to share and is a climate storyteller. If you talk about climate in any way in your life, you are a climate storyteller. And so I want to really encourage you to, whether you're talking with other people or you're listening to us speak, to know that like we're all in this together and that you have wisdom to gain and also wisdom to share. And so I want to invite you to really share it where there are openings for that in the way that we do this tonight. And actually, in the spirit of that, take a second and just look around. And just like, take everybody in. You know, we got the best seat in the house, the best view from up here. But like, you know, whether you know the people who are in this room or you don't, for the next 2 hours and maybe more, this is your community for the next 2 hours or so. And yeah. So when our goal for tonight is to explore together what makes good climate storytelling. And we're going to unpack some of the narrative tools that the four of us use and the different kinds of climate storytelling that we do, and we'll get into what those are in just a minute. But our hope, and we designed the program for tonight with the hopes that all of you will walk away with insights into how to bring more intention and clarity and more of yourselves into the climate storytelling that you do and the stories that you weave in your personal lives and in your work. So that's our goal for tonight. Woo. Cool. Yeah. So what you can expect is that in a second we're gonna do some intros. We'll introduce ourselves. We'll give you a chance to introduce yourselves to one another. We're gonna do a roundtable conversation. The four of us will chat about climate storytelling. Obviously, that's what we're talking about. We're gonna do a bit of an exercise where you'll get a chance to envision the climate future that you really long for. And then we're gonna do a Q&R, question and response, and we'll get a chance to have more of a conversation as a group. And my goal as a facilitator, timekeeping isn't always my greatest, strength, but I'm gonna try to wrap us up by 8. It might go to 8:15 or a little longer, but if we get past that point and you've gotta go, please just take care of yourselves. And we'll have some time also just to like hang out and chat and get to know one another a little more at the end. Okay, so that's the plan. Before we go any further, I want to thank Anne. Woo! Hey. Our lovely host, thank you so much. Is there anything that you want to say about the space?
Say that everybody wants to know about this. We call it a firehouse. It was sold to me as a firehouse. I think it was just a name. These are stables for the horses that pulled the water tanks before engines pulled them, between maybe 1906 and 1916 when engines came into fashion. I was looking for a studio / office in 2016. Not very actively. Nick, my husband, and I live around the corner and have for many, many years. I happened to just walk past this house about 10 days after Trump was elected. It was for sale. It was open house. I walked in and I grabbed it. And we've been using it ever since for things like this, convening people from all over the world in various configurations. So welcome to all of you. I'm delighted that this worked out. And to you.
Awesome. Actually, Anne, I have a question for you,
Yeah.
which is that we forgot to cut up some pieces of paper for people to write their questions on.
Oh, I can.
Is it possible for you to do that for us? So track them for now, but later on we'll pass those out, and both Anne and William are going to be collecting your questions. So you can pass those on to the two of them at any point, or like pass them forward, and we'll have them for later. All right, so I'm gonna shift now to introducing our amazing crew up here tonight. So what we're gonna do by way of introducing ourselves is just share who we are and what kind of climate storytelling we do, and then one piece of climate storytelling media. It could be music, it could be book, film, podcast, whatever, that has moved you. And will you start us off?
I will. Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be in a room with however many of you who all care about climate with us. And so thank you for coming. What kind of climate stories do I tell? All kinds. My friend Sam calls me the Hope Lady. A title I happily accept and probably earned with this 20-year-old book. And a lot of what I'm trying to do is find the longer time frames in which we can see change happen and see our own power. We often get really short-term stories. For example, last week, Biden canceled some more student debt. The short-term story is the nice man handed something down from above. The long-term story, and that makes us feel pretty powerless and like, oh, we just need to be nice to the very powerful. The long-term stories that Occupy Wall Street, which was called a failure within moments of its beginning, was so profoundly generative in so many ways. And one of the things it generated was a lot of attention to the incredibly destructive and corrosive effect of debt, including student debt, which created strike debt, the debt collective, etc. And that created a real transformation of public consciousness, a ton of news stories, and the pressure to abolish a lot of student debt. So the long-term story is that we're very powerful and that grassroots movements can change things, the short-term one. So I'm often looking for these longer, more complex stories, indirect consequences, unpredictability, the way things, because there's a lot of despair that comes from the sense if we do something today and, if we demand something today and we don't get it tomorrow, we've lost. And so I'm always looking for those long-term stories. And in that sense, a piece of climate media that really influenced me, there's a lovely Penguin paperback called Coal, A Human History, that came out, I think, at the end of the 90s or the turn of the century. And I read it because I'm a sort of science, history, whatever nerd, and coal is infinitely relevant to climate. And most of it was exactly what you'd expect the title to be, history going all the way back, and through the Industrial Revolution, etc. But at the very end, the woman who wrote the book said, but we don't really know how to get off fossil fuels because we have no alternatives. And it was actually the change in the 21st century had been so incremental. I had not really remembered when I read this book, probably around sometime between 2010 and maybe around 2015, that actually in the year 2000, we didn't really have an alternative to fossil fuel because wind and solar were expensive and utterly inadequate to do what we needed to do. And the cost, there's constantly graphs of the costs falling like this, the efficiency and implementation going up like this. And so that book, just by being an old story, let me see the new story, which is that we're in an energy revolution that is absolutely astounding. But again, you can only see in the long-term perspective. Even the fun tech nerd stuff I read usually talks about like what's happened in solar over the last year or something. But it was the looking back 15 or 20 years that I realized. So that was something that really kind of made me sit up and be amazed and exhilarated about how far we've come. And just add one thing, which is that, and then for a while I thought like, oh, we had an energy revolution in the past tense. And then one day I was like, no, we're at the beginning of it. We're going to have new battery materials. The curve of efficiency and cost will continue. And I think it might be almost impossible to imagine how cheap, how good it will be. And now I just really want to add that California produced 143% of its electrical needs entirely with renewables earlier this week. And that is something nobody could have imagined happening even 10 years ago. So there are some grounds. Over to you, Zoe.
How to follow that? What an amazing note to end on. Hi, I'm Zoe Young. I'm a person who needs introduction.
Sorry, we didn't say your name.
Young, like the word. There we go. So I'm a writer, a fiction writer. I'm a professor. I teach playwriting and screenwriting at Berkeley City College. And I am the head of creative content for the Nature Conservancy in California. I've been with the Conservancy for about 6 years. And so a lot of the fiction I write is based on my work in nature-based climate solutions. I recently, thanks to Autumn, who convinced me to apply, a story of mine got second place in Grist's Future Ancestors. It was great. It's called The Last Almond. It's about California's last almond farm in 2090. So that is that. We talked before, and Jess encouraged me to talk a little bit about why I joined the Conservancy. And this was in the very end of 2017. I had just finished my MFA in fiction writing. I was thinking maybe I'd teach, just like freewheeling writer out there. And then at the end of that year, I evacuated my dad from the Thomas Fire. And everything changed. It was the scariest night of my life. I was on the phone with him until 2 a.m. trying to get him to leave the house. And he finally did. And it was okay, but the fire came within a quarter mile of our house. And that entirely shifted my job search after grad school. I was looking for anyone who was doing anything meaningful on megafires. And it was a Nature Conservancy. And so within about 3 months, I was writing for them. And now my job for work is essentially translating hard science into layman's terms, layman like myself, but also there's another level of translation too, which is emotional. That I think we'll talk about this in the myth busting section, but suffice it to say that the science does not speak for itself. So there we go.
Do you want to say briefly one piece of climate media?
Yes, that's right. Oh, I had thought about a bunch. I feel like, okay, there's one piece of climate media that I think did it for me, but also really didn't do it for me. It was Ministry for the Future.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry.
We can spend an hour talking about that with you.
I was just like, okay, you're saying the things, you're saying all the right things, but can she just kiss the guy driving the hot air balloon? Can you just give us a story, Kim? Yeah, she has a desire. Can we have that oh man, I'll say so many more examples, but over to Autumn.
Amazing. Hi, I'm Autumn. You probably got an email from me. I wear a lot of different hats. I'm a designer primarily. I consider myself a storyteller and an artist as well. And the most relevant work that I've done recently is in the past year, I put together a community climate anthology for the ecoregion of New Mexico. So it featured 33 different artists and writers in the community there that just submitted. It was an open contest call and submitted their work, imagining the future that they could see from their perspectives. And then we had a community panel and chose the different pieces and put it together in a book. And relatedly, the piece of climate media that is most inspirational to me or had a huge impact on me is Adrienne Marie Brown. I mean, just like really like her as a human, but really like anything she produces. But in particular, she was speaking on a podcast a couple years ago, and it's funny because I listened to your latest book here and the interview, the conversation with Adrienne Marie Brown. She brings it up again, and she's talking about how it's really cool to do climate visionary speculative work in community because then it's very specific to a place, and everyone there has a stake in it. Everyone has something to say about it. It's relevant to everyone. And that just really inspired me, and I realized how much I wanted to have a book that was the reflections of the people I lived around, telling me how they were feeling and what they were thinking and what they were experiencing. And so I put it together with a bunch of other people. So that was a really rewarding experience, and kind of I hadn't done anything in the book space before that, and so that kind of led me more into a path of deepening into what it means to do storytelling.
And Autumn's book is called Into the Unknown Together. It can be bought
Yes.
at intotheunknowntogether.com.
Yes.
All right. Write it down.
It's so good.
It's so good. And we've met, but I'm Jess Serrante. I became a climate activist in 2007 as a college student. 8 or so years later, became a coach for climate activists, and that's been most of my work for the last several years. But in the last 2 years, I've become a climate storyteller in a new way. I've been working on a podcast with the great elder Joanna Macy. You know who she is? She's a Buddhist, deep ecologist, systems thinker, just hero and someone who's been thinking about the intersection between the way our relationship with the earth and spirituality and our relationship with one another for 50 years. And I had the great privilege in the last year and a half or so of doing 30 hours of conversations with her about how to live in these times with our hearts intact. And it's called, I almost just forgot what it was called. That's amazing. It's called We Are the Great Turning. And it dropped yesterday.
Yes, it did.
Yeah. The first episode came out yesterday, and every Monday for the next 9 weeks, you'll get another episode. And they were incredibly special conversations for me to have, but really transformed me to take these conversations with my mentor and turn them into conversations with the listener. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more. But so that's a little bit about my work. And a piece of climate media that really influenced me is there's a book called Warmth by Daniel Sherrill. And Dan is someone who I've organized sort of in parallel to, but far away, we've been in the youth climate movement together for years. And reading a book, he writes basically a letter to his future children or his future child, reporting on his experience, doing his organizing. He did a lot of work with Sunrise. And reading this book felt like reading someone telling my story. And I had never seen someone take the most intimate, personal, the longing for a child and the longing for a world that kid can live in, and bring that together with the big policy changes and what it is to be organizing with your people and the love and the frustration that's a part of that. And it moved me so deeply. I was like, you can do that. You can bring all of those pieces together. And so that was a piece that book was literally on the table with Joanna and I for the first many conversations we had, because it was such a beacon of what was possible and what we could create with our podcast. So, yeah. Thank you. Okay. So now you get to introduce yourselves to one another. So I want to invite you to turn to someone near you who you have not yet had a conversation with. And the question, we're going to do this twice. So your question is the question that we just answered. What's one piece of climate media that's really moved you? It can be anything. So find someone, we'll give you about 3 minutes, and then you'll hear the bell, and you can turn back. All right, so go ahead. I'm like trying to think about how to invite you to like give the like 1 to 3 word answer to that question. But if you see a way to do that, like where you're telling climate stories in your life, go ahead and call some of those out.
I think we felt like we're not.
Say it again.
I think we felt like we're not.
Or consumers of stories more than tellers of stories.
We can fix that.
And you said with kids. Yeah.
Human health depends on planetary health. Fiction.
Social media and everywhere.
Yeah. Journalism.
Super. Great.
Artivism.
Artivism.
Oh yeah.
I love that word.
Artist.
What was the last thing? There was a voice over here.
No, I was just. I was echoing.
Okay, great. Well, there will be more opportunities to chat with one another, but now we're going to turn to our roundtable conversation. And so I want to start us off with the question that's the title of this event, essentially, which is what makes or what is good climate storytelling?
Sorry. Where shall we start?
I really want you to like do maybe I'll just say it. There's like, I think it's important to define even what we mean by good and bad, because like what does good mean? Does that mean like effective or compelling, gets the most likes on social media, moves your heart the most? You can't quite figure it out, but it stays with you. Like what is good and like what is bad? And I guess like bad could be like ineffective or the status quo or causes hopelessness or despair. So there's a good and bad feel so loaded here. So like there's so many ways to approach it. So I don't know. That's my opener.
Well, actually, can I toss it back to you?
Yes.
Because you organized a group of people that like sat around and made some decisions about a whole bunch of stories, a whole bunch of visionary fiction stories, and like, how did you? I mean, you had to make some decisions. How did you do that? What were the like? What moved you? What was special about the ones that you chose?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, it wasn't just me. Actually, I removed myself from it entirely.
All right. Well,
I read them all, and then I actually, we like selected people in the community who were like doing climate work, or were writers or artists, were thinking about things, and then they all rated things 1 through 5, and there was a system then for like ones that went straight through, and then ones who were deliberated upon. And I was probably going to talk about this later, but I'll mention it now, is like one thing that became really, really apparent to us in the process is that although we put the call out very explicitly with a lot of descriptions about what we meant by speculative fiction or cli-fi, visionary fiction, and asking people to explicitly like lean into what it is that they want, it's very, very hard for people to do that. People often will go to what they don't want any more of, what they want to stop. And then there's like a vacuum that's left. If you stopped those things, if they just didn't exist anymore, then what? Something else will fill it. And I think it behooves us to be clear on what we want that thing to be. And so I'm kind of obsessed with that thought, and trying to get better and better at coming together with people and helping each other get clear on that imagination piece of what we want.
Yeah. I have a teacher who says, what you're fighting for is infinitely more powerful than what you're fighting against. And I mean, we're gonna do a visioning exercise. So we're gonna get to like go into this in real time together in a little while of like what can come up when we say what is the world that you want to look like.
There's a famous sentence by Frederick Jameson that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Which is a pretty grim sentence. He's talking about like in general when he wrote that. And I find that it's really hard for people to imagine the end of fossil fuels, to imagine that we live in profound change, to imagine that it's possible and stuff. And I think that a lot of apocalyptic thinking comes from the inability to imagine a world that will change beyond our imagining rather than will just somehow implode, collapse. And so, the future is an imagination exercise. And people like Adrienne Marie Brown are so good at helping us, imagine the end of capitalism, imagine the end of fossil fuel, imagine the end of, white heteropatriarchy or whatever. And I find in my case that looking at the past, and something I feel like I need to update this by a year, but I spent a lot of last year supporting our Not Too Late anthology and saying nobody in 1973 could accurately imagine 2023, let alone anybody in 1923, and yet all the best things we have, the rights for women, queer people, racial justice, environmental protections, etc., are because people fought for things within the limits of what they could see, and often we don't think exactly the way we do, but we built on what they started. And so looking backward is always helping me look forward. We can't imagine 2073 or 2123, and just update all that by a year. Looking back at how different the world was means we know that the world will both be change in ways we cannot predict or assume, and yet the things we do now will matter then, which is super obvious for climate. What we do in the next few years matters for the next 10,000 years. But I feel like despair and amnesia are really closely related, and that a deep sense of the past reminds you of profound change, and and a good version of that reminds you of grassroots stuff. The abolitionist movement of the 1830s and 40s looked puny and was literally being beat up when they tried to talk, and their big hall in Philadelphia was arson. But in 1860, they changed the United States, and ultimately, the movement ended slavery. Nobody could see that happening in an obvious way. And so just that, I think, is such a part of kind of a faith we need to have. The word hope is so fraught. I sometimes think I should give it up, but, for all these other things. But there's just a kind of faith that, I started with a quote, I'll end with a quote. E.L. Doctorow once said, "Writing fiction is like driving home at night. You can only see as far as your headlights, but it will get you all the way there."
Yes, I love that. I so agree with that. And I feel like what I might say for what makes good climate storytelling is something you've already said and not too late.
We haven't read the whole book in this room yet.
We haven't. But I think one thing I really appreciated in one of your essays was the importance of thinking collectively. And that, like, good climate storytelling, it's interesting. I feel like I work within sort of two dichotomies, that I need to reach you personally in order to get you to act collectively and to think that you can act collectively. So a lot of the reason I started writing climate fiction was because at work I get people in climate crisis, I get the species that I'm very actively working to protect, but I don't get a future human on which I can sort of pin my hopes, pin like these nature-based climate solutions actually working. And that's why I think climate fiction is so important. And often, we'll be talking about how fictional is it when it's all often based on real science. But this personalization of the climate crisis that then leads to a collective action. So making you feel it but then do something very tangible. And I think a lot of that work is sort of making up for this evolutionary gap in our brains, where we can fully understand the science behind climate change, and yet how many IPCC reports have gone by with nothing happening? Like, it is that emotional connection that actually drives action. And I think good climate storytelling will lead you to what that action could be.
Exactly. Can I answer the question a little more directly?
Please.
And in a sense, bad climate storytelling doesn't connect the dots, makes people feel powerless. And it's the nature of journalism is to report on what just happened, and a climate disaster is really fits the news model, like a fire, a flood, etc. Whereas a lot of the good news about climate is really wonky and incremental, that we've crossed a threshold of implementing this. Actually, in a bunch of parts of the world, electric vehicles have crossed the threshold for that they think is kind of makes them inevitable in the future, etc. For example, but there's no there's no explosion, there's no news thing. It's just a data point. And so I think there's a lot of, that the good news is often wonky and technical, the bad news is exciting and dramatic. But also I think that the sort of short-termism of, often people get a piece of it, this decision was made, or this bill failed, without really understanding the big picture. And so I think, for me always it's like, what makes people equipped to engage? Because we need to build a climate movement more powerful than the fossil fuel movement and its vested interests and protectors, the banks, the insurance industry, the politicians. And which, the climate movement has accomplished amazing things, which you mostly haven't heard about, which is why I put like 7 pages of climate victories and a long list of it in this book,
great.
which was super fun. And and so my brother did that artwork for the book, with the sense that story, I grew up in the Bay Area, always being told like, oh, you have to have your earthquake kit, and then you go camping, you have your camping kit, etc. That there's all this practical stuff you have for those kinds of things, but there's a kind of imaginative kit. I think it's like understanding the nature of change, understanding the nature of power in a broader sense, and then specific things. What have we accomplished? How does it work? Who's doing the work? Where are the pressure points? I find a lot of people have a lot of misinformation about, they don't get told what they can do themselves. So many people come to things like this, everything I go to, what can I do? And don't get good answers necessarily. So I think of all of those as part of the kind of toolkit that's our own body of knowledge, equipment for facing the crisis, finding our place in it. And okay, I'm going to do a shameless plug, which is, we put out Not Too Late, and I realized, like, yes, we gave the overview with global climate voices, talking about almost every aspect you could imagine of climate, but we didn't really give that thing. So there's a free download at nottoolateclimate.com, and the Haymarket's book page for this book that's just the best, most organized, what can I do about the climate emergency thing, trying to look at everything from I can't even leave the house, I'm not a citizen, to I'm ready to go hang out in the pipeline blockade. Everything from the most local to the most international, and every level in between, with examples, etc. So I really think, stories are our equipment, and giving people the ones that make them find their own power in their own place is so much of the work we need to do, along with what legislators and scientists are doing to make it happen. Give us the tools, give us the things our stories are about.
And something that I'll add to, in terms of like the podcast that I just made is like run on emotion and relationship. It's so simple in its format, in that it's just me at the table with my mentor and then me talking to the listener. But like the emotional journey, and you get to hear us in it go through like incredible joy and like tearful gratitude at being together and being alive, to like total outrage and grief at what's happening. And I'm biased on this, but I think that like emotional realness, and this is something that I've learned from getting feedback through this process of making this, is that like the best thing that I can do as a storyteller, at least in this format, is to like feel the great soup of feelings that are up for me around this out loud, because it's helping give, the feedback I keep getting is that it gives other people access to those feelings in themselves, because so many of us, because the feelings are so big, are moving around the world numbed out, struggling to feel those things, right? And like that we can, like, my hope in my storytelling is that like people will get to vicariously experience that and then access it within themselves and be able to bring it into conversation with other people, right? Where we're not like talking to one another from a place of like, oh yeah, this is the reality, this, you know, it breaks our hearts and we're like in our heads, but to drop down into our bodies and into our hearts as we talk about it, so that it actually feels like the threat and danger and opportunity that it is, which I personally find it's like hard to stay in all the time. It can be hard to sustain that. I wanna ask a surprise question to you guys because it just occurred to me. Which is that, you know, we're talking about, a lot of what you all just said was about possibility, right? And helping people see possibility. And I'm curious what you think, you know, comparing good and bad climate storytelling, we're talking a lot about the good possibilities, but I'm curious what you all think about good climate storytelling that helps us connect to the terrifying possibilities.
Let's go.
Because right, we don't want to tell stories that like are going to trigger people, that are going to put them deeper into that numbness, that are going to put them deeper into their climate anxiety. But I think there's a real place for, you know, I'm thinking about, I just read Christiana Figueres's book, what's it called?
I forget.
The Future We Choose. The Future We Choose. And there's like a amazing like 10-page section. It's like I bought everybody in my family this book for Christmas this year with the prayer that they would all just read those 10 pages. And they say like this is a like likely outcome if we don't act, and this is what's possible if we do. And they're so evocative, both of them, especially next to each other. But yeah, I'm curious what you all think about this.
Yes, so we made a thing. Okay.
Tell us about your thing.
I really want to hear what Rebecca has to say to answer this. Has anybody been biking through Golden Gate Park recently and seen some future historical markers? Okay. That is a project of the Nature Conservancy. I wrote those signs with our scientists, and Autumn here designed them. Essentially, we have made 12 California historical markers from the future.
Oh, wow.
And they're all double-sided.
Oh, they are.
Really? So it's like two versions of the.
Exactly.
Wow. Oh my gosh, I'll be.
What's going on?
I can't wait to see it. Right on over.
Awesome. Okay, let's get on your bikes. And the
Is
goal.
there a map of where they are?
Yes, they're right by.
And what's the website for them?
Nature.org/California.
We're gonna have to post like all these links, someplace where everybody can find them.
Autumn,
Yeah, we can make that happen.
Autumn is going to email everybody and collect
And I'll put them
resources,
on
and
my
we're going to
Facebook
send
page.
a blast out
Yeah.
because too many great things.
Yeah.
Not too many. Many great things are being.
Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, interrupt all day. The goal
Beware.
with the signs was to create, so the signs move forward in history, starting I think in 2024 or 2025. So for instance, 2050, last Southern California mountain lion killed by vehicle strike. And on the other side of that sign, 2050, Southern California mountain lion population saved by freeway overpasses. So every single one of the signs, moving forward, as you go toward the ocean, shows you the good future. As you come back from the ocean, shows you the bad future. And both of these futures are based on climate science that's happening right now. And the worst one, the last one, is California leads the nation in extinctions. There are a few extinction signs, but I think what I think is also in Not Too Late, this it only showing the bad future just breeds this defeatism. There's nothing we can do. We are not in this. We're not implicated, and if we are, we're bad. Showing the other possibility leaves room for possibility. But I think it's really important to actually show what could happen. I think a lot of, I really try to do this in my fiction, and a lot of really good climate fiction does this. There is hope after disaster. So the flood happens. How do we move forward? How do we change the way we capture water? What happens after something like Katrina? And what can we learn from that?
We needed another one of your books. On
I
the
know you
table
did.
right now.
I think we have to talk about both the bad things that are happening and that can happen, but it's so much about context. I think you're making the incredibly important point that a lot of climate doom or defeatism doesn't. There's a weird way white people in America love certainty so much, so they'll accept it as what I call upper middle class peasant fatalism. Which is essentially to talk about the future as though it's already been decided. And here's where, as an older person, you're like, where does she go with this? I always quote Terminator 2. No future but what we make. The future is not yet written. And so I think there's two things that occur to me in answer to Jess's question is one, that information, scientists give us that information, newspapers should report it. Newspapers often feel that information should be very bald because they think context is somehow biased. And so they often strip context from it and, narrow stories in ways. If the ocean is unhealthy, who's doing, if the ocean is sick, who's trying to protect the ocean? What would it look like to do what the ocean needs, etc. So I think one thing is the context that reminds us that as this project does, we're making huge decisions right now, not just for the next 10 or 50 or 500 years, but probably the next 10,000 plus in terms of what kind of a planet it will be. And we do have a lot of choices, and the best case scenario and the worst case scenario are so profoundly different. But something I talk about in relationship to myself is actually ocean news really hits me harder than almost anything. And and I think there's a weird thing I see, partly because I spend too much time on social media, where people feel that consuming information and emoting around it is activism, and it's actually not. It's actually not. It's super. It's super optional, and your emotions, like highlighting your emotions is not actually highlighting your engagement. You can have a huge amount of emotions and do nothing, and you can be on a pretty even keel and do a hell of a lot. And sometimes I actually feel like I'm supposed to be more emotional about this stuff, but I've been looking at it for more than 20 years, and so people who are new to something often have a very strong reaction, and it's you settle in to do the work where whether you're working with domestic violence or racism or something like that, and you have a very strong moral position on it, but you're not super reactive to each iteration. So all that kind of comes up for me, and that was a really long ramble, and now you've met me.
Brilliant. I want to move on to the next question.
Ooh.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you guys actually, because as we fully expected, this conversation could go twice as long as we allotted for it. Do you want to talk about myths, or do you want to talk about that blurred line between fiction and nonfiction?
Is this a one or the other?
It kind of is. I mean, and we can go back to them in the Q&A later, but
Should we do myths?
I'm thinking myths too.
Myths.
Okay, great. I just didn't want anyone to be like really upset at me if we didn't get to talk, So let's talk about myth making and myth busting. And when we were talking earlier about how we were talking about this earlier, we were talking about how, you know, a lot of climate storytelling helps us see possibilities. And when I think about myth, I think about the kinds of possibilities for like who we can be and how we can be together, how we can live, like, and the kinds of things that we might not otherwise be able to see about what's possible for us, like in a collective. And then on the other side, I think about busting myths, like the myths of the dominant paradigm, right? Where we like see ourselves as these like capitalist figures, like moving through the world in this very specific way where we're separate from nature and all of that. And that like climate storytelling can also be like busting open a lot of the dangerous mythologies that we've inherited from the dominant culture. So I'm curious how you all see this, or what do you think about it?
I think one myth I would really love to bust is that it's aggregate carbon or nothing. I think a lot of people look at the climate crisis as there is this much carbon going into the atmosphere and it is going to affect the entire world equally. That's really not true. I mean, the Global South will tell you this right now. It's rough. But I think, so a lot of Nature Conservancy science has led to the conclusion that nature-based climate solutions can account for about a third of the carbon reduction we need globally. But they're the only solutions that insulate us from the effects of climate change. Mm-hmm. So when you're thinking about what it means to protect California, it's not just drawing carbon from the atmosphere. That's a big part of it, but it's forest restoration, it's dunes and wetlands, it's kelp restoration, it's protecting our water sources and recharging groundwater. And all of these things can happen in a 1.5 degree climate future, in a 2 degree climate future. It's, I talked to my counterparts in the Nevada chapter, and they're after our crazy atmospheric rivers that are gonna keep coming. And the first thing out of their mouths was, well, at least you have rain. Mm-hmm. And we do. And so if we can find ways to capture this water, if we can start thinking about the ecosystem that we are, and Autumn talks about this a lot, becoming fire people again, becoming water people again, we've got a real shot. And I think looking at aggregate carbon is an excuse when we can actually be looking at our home and thinking about what it means to protect our home, and in so doing, making a really important impact on the climate crisis.
To riff off that, I see the myth making that I want to see more of is like our personal myth, like the myth that we're telling ourselves that is the story of our role in our lives. My friend Teo actually does workshops on personal myth making related to climate, because it's like we all are, even if we're not conscious of it, we are seeing ourselves as somebody who has a role, and our life has this trajectory, and we operate within these constraints, and there's this overarching story to it. And it's worthwhile to like take a step back from that and question that myth, because it can be invisible to us. And like, what are we telling ourselves is our role, and what we're here to do, and what is possible. And like, just notice it, and then decide if that's the one you actually want to be continuously recreating through your daily life. And like Zoe said, I think that there's this interesting silver lining to climate change, if there is one at all. And that's that we are remembering how to be peoples of our ecologies again. And some people have never forgotten. I want to make very clear that there's a lot of people who have been screaming loudly that like we need to be doing this, but for a lot of us, we're like in the remembering process. And I don't think there's a person in this room who hasn't learned a lot about fire in the last 5 to 10 years. We all know something. We know a lot more about it, and we know a lot more about the ecology of California and how it relates to fire. And so in a lot of ways, we're becoming fire people again. And that could be something similar said about people who are now dealing with lots of flooding and too much water. Water people again. And so there's all these ways that we're like intimately reconnecting with our ecologies that I think we don't think of it that way, but that's really what's happening. And that's really, really important. I think because that knowing more and then taking an active part it's like the seeds of like love and connection and belonging that is really like what it takes to care for places long term. So yeah, I think that's more of the myths that we need and that we need to see in ourselves and like the way that we live our lives.
That is lovely, and I think in a positive way, what I've witnessed in my lifetime, I'm a year older than Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, is the growth of among us settler colonialist types, the growth of environmental awareness that does, and it's not like there was one shift, but it's been constantly deepening and enlarging and incorporating more awareness, and that's, I think, is really changing the story that nature and culture are separate, that human beings are inherently destructive, which you can only believe if you deny the existence of indigenous people, which we pretty much did until the 1990s in the mainstream environmental movement and general kind of mainstream non-indigenous culture. But there's two myths that I think are really crucial for the climate future, ones that we both want to make or reinforce and that we want to break. And I like that we're talking about it in both ways, that the stories we need to break, the stories we need to, it's like gardening. What do we want to weed out? What do we want to water and fertilize? One is the stories we tell about human nature. There's a lot of cynicism that says that it justifies being selfish, uninvolved, greedy, callous by saying that everybody else is like this, so it's just survival to be like this. I wrote a book in 2009, really for the era of climate crises that I knew was coming, more disasters and more frequently. A book called A Paradise Built in Hell, which was very specifically about the destructive stories told about human nature, which justified, as we saw with Hurricane Katrina, which will be 20 years ago next year, essentially treating a disaster like an insurrection where controlling the population, protecting private property was the goal. And the story that you get from disaster movies and really shitty news coverage, like all the mainstream media in New Orleans in 2005, is that human beings are basically greedy, selfish, violent, and that also justifies authoritarianism at all times. And that's the tough on crime, pro-law, pro-police story we're getting told by the right now, including in San Francisco politics. What happens after most disasters is that almost everyone, except for the people deeply invested in racial divides and hierarchies and property over life, the kind of elite, the elite who panics, the great majority of people are calm, brave, creative, altruistic. They take care of each other. They improvise the rescues, the soup kitchens, and everything else. And that's why the book's called A Paradise Built in Hell. So, and what I learned from that, it's not just that we behave nicely, which is great, but what our deepest longing, but deeper, and that's the way a lot of people describe the book, deeper than that, what we most crave in life, because from the 1906 earthquake here, which I think this building is in relationship to Hurricane Katrina and after, what you see is people responding to disasters with a kind of, when they write their stories, when they told their stories firsthand, including people who were in 9/11 to me, this kind of luminous joy because they found immediacy, purposefulness, meaning, and human connection. And in a sense, everyday life under capitalism is the disaster because it strips all those things from us, tells us we're consumers, not citizens. It privatizes our souls by telling us that the only things we need are, sex, family, and a whole fucking lot of property. When we need community, we need civil society, we need democracy, we need justice, we need hope. And that brings me to the other myth that I find incredibly powerful and important for talking about climate in a way that engages people. The story capitalism tells us, and the fossil fuel industry tells us, is that we now live in an age of abundance. And if we do what the climate crisis requires of us, it means renunciation, austerity, and sacrifice. And there was some truth to it. All we really had was, lowering our consumption before renewables gave us a lot of options. And that, the weird era of compact fluorescents and Priuses in the early 2000s. But in so many ways, and obviously the great majority of people on Earth are poor. A great many of people, particularly in the global South, the Arctic, and the island nations, are suffering terribly from climate now. We do not live in abundance overall, but also even those of us, and I think that's most people in this room, who lead fairly comfortable material lives in the global North, we have poverty of hope, we have poverty of community, we have poverty of justice, and we have poverty of time. We're in a society that wants us to work frantically so we can consume frantically. And I think homeless people serve a very valuable function for that system of making people terrified to not keep grinding. This is the reminder of what happens if you fall off once, you may never get on again. And so we can tell a story, and Thelma and I keep trying to tell it, that to do what the climate crisis requires of us, if we do it right, if we do it according to our deepest dreams and our wisest leaders, could bring us an age of abundance in all these things we're poor in right now. And just looking at, like during the pandemic in northern India, when they stopped burning so much fossil fuel, etc., suddenly people could see the Himalayas again. All over the world, people reported clear air and birdsong that they hadn't noticed before. Fossil fuel is political poison. It's completely corrupted our global geopolitics. It's also everyday poison that kills almost 9 million people a year through particulate inhalation alone. It gives kids in Richmond, California, asthma. There's a reason Cancer Alley is called Cancer Alley in Louisiana. People are going to look back in 100 years and say, oh my God, they dug all this dead stuff out of the ground that was incredibly toxic at every stage, from extraction, transportation, refinement, and consumption. And they lived in a foul and poisonous and corrupt world, and it seemed completely normal to them. But we look back in horror at the age of fossil fuels. Thank God we left it behind. And so that's one of the ways the future could look. And we can, so that's a myth I want to bust. We now live in abundance. And I'm actually good with everyone giving up hamburgers. However, because the right is telling everyone that they want to take your cars and hamburgers away. I'm like, I actually, I'm big on public transportation and alternatives to hamburgers, but harm reduction is a very good model for everything. Whew. I think I ripped up.
I love you sat up more. So
I'm reaching my prosperity gospel.
I love it. I'm just gonna add one small thing, and then I'm gonna move us into the next piece, which is, as you were talking about that, Rebecca, I was thinking about the myth that I spent a lot of the last year thinking about how to bust, which is a lot of what Joanna teaches is breaking down the myth of separation. And the more that I think about it, the more I just see it everywhere, that like the thing that keeps us from action is the sense that we are somehow separate from what's happening to our planet, or we are somehow separate from what's happening to those people a state over from us, or in Palestine, or in India, right? That we like see a separation. And my experience is that the more that I break down that wall, the more I learn to see myself as a part of an interconnected web, the more action is just a reflex. It's like when someone you love needs something or is in danger, you just reach in. It doesn't, we can get caught in this analysis, this like intellectualizing of what is it to act and how do I do it right and what is my place and how do I do it in a way that's going to advance my career in the right way and like all of those like big questions. And I may all of us be supported well to do this work. I don't mean to like slash at that because I know what it's like to not be well supported to do this work. But that breaking down the myth of separation and building a new mythology of who we are together on the planet, which I love this thing that you were talking about, being fire people and being water people, like being people who belong to one another and people who belong to the land and belong on this earth, right? There's also that narrative that can come up from time to time in the climate movement that like earth will be better without us. Like we're just these like pests that it's like I hate that so much.
It's like which we, yeah,
Yeah.
because that's so insulting to people who've always taken care of the earth.
Yeah, and who have come from this and live in
Yeah.
So we need to remember how to live in reciprocity. But to break down the separation and come into another sense of belonging, I think is one of the most valuable things that we can do to find the piece of action that is ours to take, to tell the stories that are ours to tell, that are like the most, personal, true to us stories, which I think is one of the things that really makes the best storytelling. Is when you're telling the story that's yours to tell, your experience, your emotional landscape of this. It's not this abstract thing that's far away. It's touching every one of our lives in every moment.
I love that.
Now I'm on my soapbox.
I love that you use the word reciprocity because most of us heard all our lives responsibility, which is like do your chores and it's kind of grim and joyless and, puritanical. Whereas reciprocity begins with, I have received so much that I'm grateful and living in abundance and I want to give back because, I've received so much. And so I really got that from Robin Wall Kimmerer, and I've been trying to speak about reciprocity instead of responsibility. So I love that you use that word. It's not exactly a myth, but I think it's a great shift in focus.
All right, y'all. We are definitely going past 8 o'clock. Just letting you know. So, like I said before, take care of yourself if you gotta go. But we're gonna go a little longer than that. And I hope that you can stay in conversation because what we're gonna do now is you're gonna get a chance to chat with one another, and then we're gonna do a little bit of visioning exercise. So what I want to invite you to do is to turn and get a little cluster of 3 or 4. 2 is fine, but somewhere in there, and just chat with each other for a couple minutes about like what are you getting from this. More specifically, you can look at like what are the ideas that came up in this conversation that are intriguing you? What are the questions that have emerged for you? That kind of thing. So go ahead. I'm going to give you about 4 minutes. Is to let these visions that have emerged be seeds for the way that you talk about climate when you step out that door. That you look for ways to plant seeds to like let your life be a microcosm of that world, because that's how we do it, right? It's by each of us taking steps every day to build that possibility and to bring it into being piece by piece. Okay, so it's 8:15. Oh yeah, thank you. And Jeremy just reminded me of something very important, which is I want to be sure to credit that exercise comes from a talk by someone named Donella Meadows, who wrote an amazing book on systems thinking, among other things. And I'll put it in the resource list. But also, if you want to do this exercise again and you just love hearing me facilitate it, on Monday, this upcoming Monday, when the second episode of my podcast comes out, there will be a guided version of this. So you can come back to it and you can do it again.
What's the website again, Jess?
The podcast is called We Are the Great Turning. It's on all the podcast apps, and you can also go to wearethegreatturning.com, and there's a toolkit and lots of like prompts and practices and exercises that you can use to take some of the topics from the episodes deeper into your life, and you'll also hear me pitch that to you if you listen. So we're gonna do some Q&R.
If you have to go, it's okay. Don't
Yes.
think we won't think
Yes,
you're rude.
if-
Yeah, like
I'll be
thank you so
judging
much
you.
for being here.
They will judge you like no one else questions and final thoughts. Oh yeah, for sure.
Great, you lead us.
Oh,
If
okay.
you like. There were too
Go for
many,
it.
the questions were too
We got
good.
some great
apparently.
questions.
Okay. And whoever this is, if you want to like raise your hand, I'm just curious too, but you don't have to. Question is, can you speak to how you think about spirituality, ritual, the sacred and divine, and climate storytelling?
Maybe this person who hung out with Joanna Macy a
Yeah.
lot should start.
Can you read the question again?
Can you speak to how you think about spirituality, ritual, the sacred and the divine, and climate storytelling?
Think about that a lot. Whose question is that? It was you. I love that. Will you say a little bit more about what your question is? Because I could go in a lot of directions with it.
I don't know. I think a lot about it because I really feel the lack of that story in my storytelling, specifically with my children. I think about how I bring that into the stories that I tell kids, and I think I had a lot of that growing up, but it was very in a religious context that I sort of left and moved away from, and it was a really, and we talked a lot about myth, and that has that quality too, but I think in some ways my modern relationship to spirituality feels very utilitarian or something, it's I feel this lack, and so I need this tool or something to do, to do something. But I feel this in the storytelling with children because they inhabit this really different sort of mindset of their myth building about the world. I don't know. That's very meandering.
I'm glad to hear you elaborate because I love those children. So the question touches me even deeper. Also, coming from a religious background that I left and that doesn't resonate with me anymore, I think one of the things that I have learned to do with more courage, it used to really scare me coming from my activism background of organizing, that I really for a long time kept my spiritual connection to the earth very separate from my activism. And I have become bolder over the years. I think this is partially through my work as a coach in just trusting the reality that we all inherently have a spiritual connection to the planet that we live on. And spirit, you can define that however you want, right? But we are of this place and we belong to it. And we have a responsibility, a sacred responsibility to it. And at least the people that I spend a lot of time talking to are people who are dedicated to doing something about what's happening. And I have come to safely assume, no one's pushed on this yet, but to safely assume that we all carry with us, you don't do this work for fame and fortune, right? You do it because you have a deep longing in your belly and in your soul that you need to, because this is your home and because it's you. And it's taken me a long time to be willing to say that, to assert that. But I find that it's really effective when I do, because I think a lot of us feel like we have to keep these pieces separate. Like, how could I be like working for policy and also like talk about how much I do this because I just love this planet, or because I just love life, you know? And like professionalism can sort of keep us from bringing those two true realities of who we are together. And it does take courage, because people, you know, it's like there's a lot of like bad mythology about separation, that here I am on that again, that I know when I bring these two things together, I worry about meeting. Like that someone's gonna say, you're crazy. You're wrong, right? No, we are just, you know, whatever the myths are. So I'm personally learning in the way that I tell stories to just be really, really real about my love and about my sense of connection and the connection that I wish for all of us. Yeah. Yeah, you anything you want to add to that, or you want to jump to the next question?
I kind of wanted to say one thing about developing your own sense of belonging, and getting curious about your journey of belonging, because if you take seriously through probably the easiest way to start like having a connection to the earth, if you don't know where to start, is to pay attention. And pay attention to any little thing and see where that goes. And through that process, I think that's actually how you build belonging to the earth and to like more than human creatures and plants that we are surrounded by. And if you develop that sense of that kind of belonging, it cannot be taken away from you. We often think of belonging as like just in the human sphere. And we struggle with it. Sometimes we want to be invited to the things we want to be thought of. We want to feel a part of a thing. And that's important. But another important piece that's not often thought about is this like piece of belonging to the earth. And like there's no bottom. It's just an endless depth that you can go into, and no one can take it away from you.
Well said. Or do you want to say something? I don't want to cut you off.
And I could.
Do you want to go to the next question, or do you want to answer this one?
Anything.
I want to ask. I want to answer this question. I feel like we all
let's go
should.
for it.
So this question is: one takeaway seems to be just do the work, but how do you define the work? How do you decide how to focus your energies? I think this is a really important question, and I'm excited to hear all of us answer it. I'm just going to be very practical here. Every single one of us in this room can train to perform prescribed burns in California. Everybody can do it. There are so many ways to just plug in to big old stewardship of this state. Also, we got a climate bond coming up. And it's big, and it's going to pass a big hurdle, hopefully, in the governor's office, but that'll be early-ish June. But then talking about you know, the importance of appropriating money to do all of these important works, and trying to make it happen in whatever way you can. But I think the thing for me that fuels this policy work is the boots on the ground. Is the like restoration in the salmon stream, the conducting controlled burns, working under a burn boss who does this every day. And we as civilians can all become a part of this, and just finding the first way you can to plug in will lead to other ways. There you go.
I'll take some more. I think everyone in this room, almost everyone, has something to contribute. I think there's often a sense, like I have a very funny thing with the climate movement. I kept waiting for someone to tell me what my job was, and in a way I felt like I should do, first of all, maybe I should get arrested more and it should be frontline, etc. That I was having what I think of as a very Protestant moment, that I had to sort of renounce doing what I really liked doing. And, can't say I actually love meetings, but I am involved with 3 climate groups, and meetings are part of how we get it done.
So you're on a lot of
there
meetings.
is that. But we often get a very narrow thing. You go to an event for one group and they're like, sign up for our mailing list, give us money, come to our events. But really, like I said before, and this is the whole gist of the what can I do about the climate emergency, free downloadable pamphlet at nottoolateclimate.com. Sorry, I feel like
Read your
I'm
follow-up
selling
email.
it, but at least it's free. There's so many different things people can do that matter, and this is about all the practical things. But what I also say there, and say a lot of times, is just being a really informed person about climate who talks to other people about climate, bring it up in conversation. Something I find a lot of times is people don't know a lot of basic things. We have the solutions, we know what to do, they keep getting better. We're not all gonna die next week or next year or in 10 years. That it's not all cows. You get people who are really obsessed with one thing.
It's not all cows.
It's not all cows, it's not all painting roofs white, it's not all bicycles, but all those, addressing all those things is good. And so really just becoming an informed person who can bring people on board first, that there are things we can do, that we can actually be excited and engage. Because something I feel like I'm seeing a lot is people who get a little, it's like they open the door a crack and they're like, this is super scary, and they shut it. And then they're not terribly informed about climate, and they think if they open that door wider, it'll be even scarier. Something that I've really started to notice is that the people deepest in climate, the scientists, the organizers, the long-term involved people, they're not lying cross-state with horror. They're like, this is really serious. I understand the worst case scenario. I also understand the best case scenario, and I'm going to do everything I can. And so there's formal things to do. And of course, there's like the stuff we can all do as citizens, and like recycling is not that exciting. Voting is pretty exciting. And, there's a lot of different ways to participate. And I think things like donating, if you have a lot of money, give some of it to good climate groups. And that's often treated, and by a lot of money, I mean like if you're just a person earning like a nice tech salary or something, and donating, which I do, is it 5 figures? The lowest 5 figures, is often treated as like, it's, like avoidance of work, but it's translating your labor into labor climate organizers will do. It's really good.
That's true.
And so I think there's a ton of things people can do. And something that's really important, again, when you have your climate conversations, all the surveys, studies, polls show, even though people who've just opened that door a crack think nobody cares, and that's part of the loneliness, I think, of climate grief and despair, the great majority of people, every place they've asked, know about climate, care about climate, really support climate action. The part of what's keeping people from just do the work is they don't know what the useful work is. And often when you ask people, what are you doing about climate, you get people saying like, oh, I don't fly or recycle. And there's a whole thing where climate footprints were really pushed by the fossil fuel industry, because nothing would be better for them if we all stayed home quietly, politically disengaged, just trying to be perfect in our consumption lives. So, whereas getting out there and fighting the fossil fuel industry is fucking awesome and one of the most important things you can do. So there's a ton of things to do. And what works for one person, some people like blockades and arrests and police confrontations, and some people are actually really good at dogging city council meetings until the legislation goes through. And those are really different people, and figure out who you are and what your place is. And there's a lot of different things, I think, as part of it. It's a whole ecosystem of engagement.
I just want to echo you on the professionalism piece, and I think that there's I want to challenge, because I know, since I'm the one who took all of your intakes in of like your titles and everything, so I know there's a lot of people who actually work in climate for their day jobs, and I just want to challenge that like authenticity is at odds with professionality, and that you have to be this like like challenge that story, that narrative of like what it means to be professional, and that you can't bring certain parts of yourself and how you feel to your job.
Can you read the first sentence of the question? Where is it? I was just looking for it. It was like,
Just one takeaway seems to be just do the work, but how do you define the work?
is that the question we just asked?
That's the question we just answered.
Oh. About finding your part in it.
Oh, and how do you decide where to focus? Yeah.
Yeah. How do you decide?
How do you do
So,
it?
I have a few thoughts on this. One is surrender the idea that there is a right way to do it. Like, just let that go. Because that is the number one thing in my work as a coach with climate leaders that I see paralyze people. I gotta get it right. It doesn't exist. You're not gonna do it right. But you can do something, right? And you can do whatever you do really well, right? But like there's not perfection in this, and there's also no such thing as doing enough. Right? And I just like time and time again watch people just freeze in the face of worries about that. And then in terms of where to focus your energies, I think the answer is probably closer to each of us. It's like under our noses. Like it's a lot closer to each of us than we actually think it is. Like look to what you love. Look to what breaks your heart. The climate crisis is like, it's not just climate policy, right? It's racial justice, it's gender justice, it's democracy, it's everything. It's the big, big tent. So whatever piece of it is that like really fucking pisses you off or really lights you up, that's the like place to go in my thoughts. And with that, my friends. When do we need to be out of here, Anne?
There's no limit. Yeah, we'll start cleaning up a little bit.
Okay, great. So hang chat, and we'll move towards the door in like whatever. When Anne tells us to.